theology as it relates to the Mars Hill podcast. We are glad for those who are just watching a little later, did not have an opportunity to join us live for this conversation. And we missed having you. We're going to have a great conversation here, but we're glad you're able to join us now. We're really primarily focusing on 4 questions. For those who were following along with the Mars Hill storyline that ended in 2014, and those specifically over the last 6 months who have been following along with a podcast entitled The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's been a fascinating storytelling perspective from CT Magazine that has been put out in a podcast. And as a network, we thought we'd come together and talk about it. A lot of pastors sitting around coffee tables having conversations about this podcast and about Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll in and of itself. And Idea Network's always been a place where we bring the Denny's conversation to the virtual world or a real world moment where we can actually have that conversation and see what lessons can be learned. We're going to be discussing 4 questions, and we've got 4 specific leaders who will be addressing each one of these 4 questions. The way today will work is I'll introduce those 4 questions, then I'll introduce the 4 guests who will speak to those 4 questions, and then those 4 guests will throw that specific question to the community. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts. We do not expect that every single one of the ministry leaders on the call today are going to have the exact same perspective. Good. That's exactly what we want. We want you to share your unique point of view. We want to see what you've learned or how you're viewing the entirety of the conversation. So we're glad you're here. We want you to speak in, and don't feel intimidated to press the unmute button and speak up when we give you the opportunity. So let's go ahead and begin. After this introduction, let's go ahead and begin by introducing all 4 of the questions and the 4 speakers that will introduce these questions. First and foremost, today we have Harley Snowd. Harley Snowd will be addressing the question, what personal lessons should the ministry leader take from this podcast and the story of Mars Hill? The second individual that we've got helping us today will be Akeem Smith. Akeem Smith will be asking, what ecclesiastical conversations should we be having after learning about the devastation at Mars Hill? Akeem Smith. Now, understand what we're doing. Number 1, the first one is really personal. The second one is theological. The third question we'll be asking as we move forward is from Josh Cox. What should be the role of Christian journalism in the evangelical church? He's going to be specifically, I'm sorry, that's the 4th question. The third question will be my question. The third question is, what is the state of the megachurch in the United States now? And then the 4th question will be addressed by Josh Cox. What should be the role of Christian journalism in the evangelical church? Let's go ahead and begin with Harley Snowd. Why don't you address that question, introduce yourself, address the question, and then throw it to the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. So I pastor in Amish country, Ohio, pastor a church plant of about a dozen years, and could not be further from the Mars Hill context. So that's an interesting, dynamic for me as I've been processing it. The question that I'm answering is, what are the personal lessons? And I've talked with several of you about this. If you don't see anything in the podcast as it relates to you, you're not self-aware, at least would be my humble opinion. I've been challenged by it greatly. So a few things I jotted down. The first one would be, and then we'll open it for discussion, would be, I don't know how you started out watching the podcast, but I have to admit this, that I did not start listening with, I'm going to see myself in this. It was more as a bystander, curiosity, kind of just, I'd like to hear the followers, their perspective. And as I went further, I'd say about episode 4 or 5, I started to see myself, to be honest with you, in the storyline and the tendencies as a church planner. There are a lot of parallels on a much smaller scale, obviously. But one of the biggest things that jumped out at me was, I don't know if you caught it, it was one of the last episodes where Driscoll's wife asked him word association, and she threw out the word people. And Mark said dangerous. I don't know if you remember that. People are dangerous. And I found that striking because I have to be honest with you, at times I view people as at least a risk, if not a threat. And in reality, it was the mindset that people are dangerous that was the most dangerous, really, component of the narrative. Lack of accountability. We're going to talk about church polity, I think, in a few minutes here, as well as just support, counsel, encouragement. So that was very challenging to me, to make sure that I am availing myself to people that God has providentially put in my life, either in our church, outside resources, even such as the network here, and being very vulnerable and open in those settings. So that was very, that resonated with me. Secondly, I found this striking. I will be ultimately evaluated both in history and eternity more by the quality and the longevity of my ministry than the quantity or the pace at which I expand influence or rapport with people. I don't know if you caught that, but over and over, Mars Hill would use numbers to either offset liabilities or threats or questions. Hey, we're still growing. And that's the sign of God's favor. Or as they look to the future, we're going to have this many church plants, or we're going to grow to 50,000. Numbers was really the thing they looked to, both to affirm the past, process the present, and then it was the exclusive vision, what set the vision for the ministry. And I fight that. I'll be honest with you. Numbers is always something we all have to process. So that was very convicting to me. And then obviously cranking out books, plagiarism, cutting corners just to generate output and content. That's something we all have to navigate, that tension regularly. And so that was very insightful to me, in just my little world, ways that I need to work to guard against that. One of the other big ones that I was struck by is how often Driscoll and those that I think were influenced by him made themselves the hero of the story. I think it was either the last episode or the episode before the last, where one of his assistants said to him, Jesus has gotten lost in your shadow. And that really resonated with me. Like when folks listen to me, when I'm the one leading, I'm the voice. Am I in the way of Jesus? Is my profile and my shadow, is it hindering a fresh glimpse, a full gaze of Jesus, who he is? And so that was especially insightful too. And then just two more quickly. One would be how I treat women in the ministry, both in my house and in my ministry, will largely shape the relational, familial impact of my ministry. And you see Driscoll and those that he was leading really not treating women as he should have. And I think we all have to work through that. There are ladies on this call today, whether it was under the guise of they need protected, they need taken care of. Many of the women said, that felt demeaning, that felt disempowering, et cetera. So I think we have to be careful with that. And then obviously the over-sexualization of the teaching, the writings, how that was viewed through the lens of the wives of staff and church members. I heard several years ago a statement, I don't know if this resonates with you. One of the best litmus tests of a pastor, their character, where they're at with the Lord, is what does the wife of that pastor, the face of that wife, do when he enters the room, when his name comes up? What does the wife of that pastor, how does she respond to him? And so I think a lot of my ministry, there are areas I can grow in that. So that was challenging to me. And then the last one would just be staff. I don't know about you guys. I have two staff, probably adding a third one here shortly, but obviously the staff was a strained relationship. That story was so sad, where you had the guy with the eye infection, if you remember that. And then there was another pastor that ministered to his need, and his own pastor just wanted to know if it was infectious or not. It was seen as an inconvenience. It slowed down. And am I caring for my staff in a way that they have a different, memory of my influence? How they left, there's some on this call, you guys used to serve together, and it's awesome to see you still having fellowship, even though that season has passed, and you see the scorched earth kind of policy with staff as they would leave. And just the heartbreaking stories of people just broken as they left, invested year after year. And I don't want that to be true of our staff whenever God leads them on or leads me on. So that was challenging as well. And then the last thing on that would be, I don't know if you remember the quote by Tripp, where he talked about, he sat down with the staff And he said he felt like he was meeting with a bunch of Vietnam vets with PTSD. They were just so jarred and so broken and so shattered by serving under this man that he didn't even know where to begin. Tripp, with all of his, training and background and wisdom. And I don't want to be that. I think sometimes we can use our staff, for those of us who are senior leaders, and sometimes at the expense of those that we serve with. So God really challenged me on that. And then the last thing, just a verse, would be, we were in 2 Peter 2 this last Sunday, where it talks about false teachers or leaders are wells without water. And I think one of the questions I would ask us today that God's been working in me on is, as those that follow me get further down the road with me, am I still providing refreshing, renewing truth and love that ages well? And I think for me, I'm judged more by those that are with me for the long term and those who live closest to me than anybody that I attract a following with at a distance. Really, it's those that are in my immediate context that are going to shape and define me as a leader. So those were just a few things that jumped out at me. So kind of let me put it back on the group today. And I appreciate Josh giving me the opportunity to share a few things. That's just kind of a smattering of concepts. So that's what I've learned. So if you just raise your hand or indicate you're willing to share with us as a group, what's a personal lesson or two that you have learned from your interacting with this story? So whoever wants to start us out. I can't see everybody, Josh, I don't think.
That's okay. I'd be super interested to throw it to Aaron Carpenter. And the reason is because Aaron serves in that community and knows that community. I'm wondering, we're talking specifically about personal lessons that have been learned. What have you seen in the community based on this, and what lessons have you taken away?
Yeah. We came to the region just as Mars Hill was collapsing. So summer to fall of 2014 was when we were making our move. That was all, tumbling down, and we walked into, a group of church planters and church leaders that had very close personal relationships with everything that was going on there. I would say the biggest takeaway from me walking in was, Harley, you mentioned the emphasis on the numbers, which I thought was so interesting, especially when they went down to Quest Field. They had that big Easter service down there. And, even in the podcast, they mentioned about how actually lame that really was, because, here's a 70,000 seat stadium, and, they had 17,000 at best, I think. When we first came in, we were trying to get a pulse on the church planting in the area. To me, Mars Hill, Mark Driscoll, they were larger than life. I mean, they were the biggest thing on the evangelical scene for the last 5-10 years. And when I talk to unchurched people, most people have never heard of them. Now, Adam and Zeb may have slightly different experiences. But the people I talk to, maybe there was a newspaper article a couple of years ago. Mark Driscoll, I don't know, that name kind of sounds familiar, maybe. And I just thought, the biggest thing for us, he's huge, right? He's a nobody. We're here to reach the unchurched, and the biggest thing we can come up with hardly even makes a headline. And I think that there is such a massive dose of humility that we can take from that and step back and say, even if I'm the biggest thing, the famous, most famous preacher, prolific author, the people I'm trying to reach will probably still never hear my name.
Yeah, that's good, Aaron. That's great perspective. It's good.
Aaron, that is fantastic. You specifically threw out Zeb and Aaron in that area. What have you guys seen as it relates to
that? Zeb here, checking in. There's a lot of things, Josh, that I could say, I think, about this podcast and about the region. We don't have time for today, but I'll go ahead and turn my video on so you can see it. I'm on my phone today, so otherwise I normally would have my computer up. We have a lot of people actually in our church. We're in Renton, so we're just south of Seattle and Bellevue. We've got a lot of people in our church who are what I call Mars Hillians. They've come over, and a lot of them are still call it gun shy, call it non-committal, uncertain as to how deep and how far they want to commit to something. And we're a little bit of a larger church. We've actually experienced situations somewhat similar in the last couple of years, which has even created more lack of trust and uncertainty amongst church leadership. So there's just a lot of people who are hurting. I think Steve threw that out in the chat. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. And I've talked with people personally who are at Mars Hill, who've listened to the podcast, who are experiencing PTSD, and people who have stopped listening to the podcast because they just can't deal with the process. So I think for me personally, the benefit from listening to this, I think I love, Harley, what you said. You begin to see yourself and you begin to, man, what do I need to be careful of? And I think as a leader leading people, we just have to be careful that we don't let that determine who we are, right? Form our identity, in either the amount of people that we lead or how we're leading people. And I think, anyway, I could continue talking all day, so I'll shut up and let other people talk. But I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned just from examining your own heart. And one of the things that I tweeted out, one of the first episodes, I think, of the podcast talked about how someone's character was not pacing with their, the growth of the ministry. I think that's another thing that we have to be careful of as things grow and we want them to. Are we the type of person, is our character growing with that?
I think it's one of the most amazing aspects to the entire conversation, whether or not character is pacing along with our growth. For me, the big lesson I think I took away personally is the aspect of elevation of kindness. Am I kind? Jesus was a kind man. He was a gentle man. And I do believe that in our modern society, we do elevate those who exhibit force and strength. We look at leaders like the late great Steve Jobs, or we look at leaders like a Driscoll, or Donald Trump. Nobody can deny great men who accomplish great things, but who tend to lack kindness. And I think kindness is an aspect of Christ's demeanor that I think we should be reflecting. And I'm not saying that that's something you should be doing. It's something that God really hit me on. How kind am I? Specifically, how kind am I to the people that are closest to me? I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I feel like I can put it on and turn it on whenever I'm around all the people that I need to be, and I've got my kind mask on, and then suddenly, when I'm just with my team or just with my family, I don't have to put on anymore. I'm angry inside. I can just show it. And I realized, man, what a damaging thing that can be. And I can definitely see myself in the story. I'm really interested to go to that second question with Akeem Smith. There's personal things that we can learn from this, but the second thing that we can learn is ecclesiastical conversations. What about our church polity? What questions are raised? Does this determine somebody's not only philosophy of ministry, but somebody's theological position ecclesiastically? Does it make you question anything as it relates to your ecclesiology? I'm interested to bring that to Akeem and have Akeem bring that to the team. Akeem, what are your thoughts? Introduce yourself first for those who don't know you.
Yeah, for sure. My name is Akeem Smith, and I'm a church planner here in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. Started Storyline Church in 2019, September. I'm 6 months before COVID. And we're going. Things are coming back into full swing, and it's all 5 cylinders firing, and it's got some special things here in the Bay. So glad to be a part of it. But yeah, this conversation is, I see a lot of friends on the call, like Steve and Zeb and Matt and some other folks on here that, we've had some of these conversations in the past, some of the stuff. But man, when it comes to ecclesiology and some of the things that we've seen from the podcast and had conversations with, I think the big thing that I kind of took notes of specifically for this conversation that I kind of want to discuss, and I'll put it back to everyone else to hear your thoughts and inputs on it. But before I do, I just want to bring out a piece of scripture. Sorry, I'm a pastor, so you know what I mean. I have to share scripture. So it's in Matthew chapter 20. And so this is just when I think about Mars Hill and the podcast, like this is what comes to mind was these words of Jesus with his disciples. And there's this Sons of Thunder, James and John. And the chapter starts out with the kingdom of heaven is like, and they talk about who's going to be the greatest. You're going to sit with Jesus, and Jesus kind of gathers all of them, and he's he's walking down the path, and he gathers all of them and says, hey, because they're having a conversation in the back about like, hey, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And then Jesus kind of overhears them, and then he says, hey, sit down, Peter, look at me, Peter, and gets their attention and says to them, you know how the Gentiles and the Pharisees lord it over them. And he looks at them and he says the words in verse number 28. He says, not so with you. And when I think about the story of Mars Hill, and I don't want to focus necessarily on Mark or on the church, but the principles within the church that existed. And so when I think about the story, I think about just this scripture that Jesus said to the disciples that, the Pharisees and the scribes lorded over them, but my kingdom, not so with you. And so there's two things that just kind of want to bring out when it comes to just this topic is one, leadership structure and then church structure. So when it comes to like our theology, we talk about ecclesiology, right? What is ecclesiology? It's taking what we believe about God and bringing it into the structure of our leadership within the organization of the church, but also what the church organizes around. And so those two things I just kind of want to bring out, one being leadership structure. So Andy Stanley, he talks about this idea of leadership presence. Whatever you think about Andy Stanley, he's a phenomenal leader. And one of the things he says is this principle of if you stand in one place long enough, the organization will organize around you, right? And so I think some of the things that we see in the principles within the rise and fall of Mars Hill is that the leadership made decisions in a vacuum. And in those vacuum, there's only them in the room. If you check the podcast out, there's a couple of people that are making just linear decisions, and they just organize everything around them, around one person, which was really Mark. He was bombastic. He had this personality that was bigger than life, and no accountability. Decision making was just made in a vacuum, and so. So Andy Stanley says that if you stand in one place long enough, the organization will organize around you. It's like my wife. Like when she we look at our schedule this past year, and we're like, we need to make some changes. So she cooks in our house. That's just how it works. Like she cooks meals. But I volunteered myself and said every Tuesday night I'll make dinner. Now for some reason every Tuesday night it comes around and I just forget that I'm making dinner. Because in our house, how it works is that Jamie makes dinner every night. So our house is organized around her doing that. So by default, my mind, goes somewhere else on Tuesday night because I haven't stood in that place long enough. And so it's the same idea. It's not bad that she makes dinner every night, but if we're going to build a strong house, if we're going to build a strong family, a strong organization, then we're going to have to organize that organization around something else that's bigger than us, right? And so when I think about ecclesiology and implementing our theology into our church, into organizations, how do we organize it around what will benefit the most people, and not just the top, right? In the world and the flesh, how it works when it comes to leadership is we make decisions that empower us, that eventually give us more power, but not so with us, as Jesus talks about, right? We leverage our power and our presence for the sake of the entire organization. And so that was something that touched me. It's like, man, what am I doing in our church currently that's I'm standing in a place too long, that if I left, that something happened, that this church would crumble because I've stood in one place too long. And so church leadership and then just church structure. And the big idea here, and I'll be done, is oftentimes, I know in my case, this is just maybe the nature of church planting, and I'm always meeting different pastors and churches that are interested in partnering with church plants. But it's so tempting for me personally, maybe not for you, but for me, it's so tempting to look at the other churches that are growing and that are bigger and begin to replicate their structure and their leadership in their church, and bring it to Storyline and bring it to Oakland, and to replicate that, as opposed to starting with a biblical approach and mandate for what the church should be structured around and what it should look like. And so those are the two things that I would say that really spoke to me. And as I jump on this call, I see some friends on here that I love to hear your thoughts and your perspective about those, maybe those two things. You can start with those two things, leadership structure. How can we structure our churches and our teams around this idea that will benefit the most people, not just us, not just our power, but then also just the structure around like the local church in general.
So if you haven't thought on that, I know it's strange to throw your hand up and be like, oh, I know, I'm the expert, just like Mark was. So let me be the first to speak in, but I would love for somebody to help and say, you know what my thoughts are. For example, I'm specifically thinking of like, yep, Steve Miller, I was hoping you would. Thanks, Steve. Jump in and give your thoughts on it relates to ecclesiology. Is it possible to have a theological position that is single elder led or a plurality of elders and fall into the trap? Or is it possible to have a different structure and not fall into that trap? What are your thoughts, Steve?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you are. I think, honestly, it's hard for us to judge what we would do given the same set of circumstances. So I honestly feel like Mark, and I think he right now, by the way, he's pastoring church. It seems like his family's doing good, things like this. And so I'm thankful for that redemption. I think Mark's the kind of guy, like he had the right motives, but just went about it with the wrong methods. And so like, I feel like, yes, I think in a smaller church, and when you don't have a plurality of elders, when you're the guy, then yeah, a lot of it does have to fall to you. I think that you just have to be self-aware enough to realize that it's not you that's making it happen. And I was with a group of pastors a couple of months ago. We were on a trip, and we were talking about this idea of like, all of us on this call are savvy enough, we're strong enough leaders that we could grow the church. Like, I can persuade enough people to come on Sunday morning and be a part of the service or take a next step. And I think that's when we can get in trouble. And so I feel like that model, yes, if it's all upon you to make it happen, I think then, yeah, you can lead to some trouble. But I don't think that every situation where the guy is in charge and he's leading and making decisions is a bad model, because it's just not possible. So I feel like sometimes we think, well, I don't want to be like, the show, so I won't do anything. I think there's a fine line there. I think you have to, that's why I think it comes down to your personal walk with Jesus, that you realize it's also sometimes reminding yourself, like on Sunday mornings, like I say this in our church, I'll say to our church congregation, hey, it's God's church. He's doing a great job with it. And as much as I'm saying it to them, I'm actually saying that to me, that it's not me that grows the church. God grows the church, but all I need to do is be faithful to serve and to love and to do what he's called me to do. And some of us can do that with more bombastic personalities. Some of us can do that with a little bit more natural ability on a social media platform. But ultimately, at the end of the day, God grows the church. And that's it. And when we get to the place where we are doing things because we think that's how the church is going to grow, that's where I think the problem lies. Those are just.
Yeah.
I love it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I love what Steve said. I've actually, so there's a church about maybe 15 minutes from, 45 minutes from us. It's called Echo Church. It's a huge supporter of ours, just incredible people, and very controversial. But they had a conference there every year called the Echo Leadership Conference, and they invited Mark Driscoll to the conference. And he was on the platform, and Andy, incredible leader, gifted personality, and just a good person. He was interviewing Mark Driscoll for this, and he brought up some of these topics that we're talking about kind of now. And I can agree with Steve in some ways that Driscoll has seen that he's changed a lot and maybe matured in some ways, but he's still Driscoll in a lot of ways. You can't change someone's personality, but maybe the posture of their heart kind of develop over time. But yeah, I agree with what Steve said in the sense that, like, it's okay to be who you are, what God's called you to be. It's good to identify your strengths, right, and your gift sets and what God's called you to lead, but to lead it in such a way that you lead it, that it's not dependent on you, right? It's not that you stop doing those things, but you lead it like you're not going to be there always. And I think that's like a key principle.
I love it. Well said. Adam Perlstein had his hand up a moment ago. Adam, I'd love to hear what your thoughts were on this scenario and what you were sharing. Unless Adam's Wi-Fi kicked him off.
I think he got kicked off, Josh.
Okay, we'll go back to him in a moment then if he jumps back in. Matt Elin just raised his hand. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just love to share a thought on that. I wrestled with this as far as I'm like, okay, I'm hearing a lot of things that Driscoll did, and I'm like, ooh, that was good. That was smart and just practical. But then a lot of the character things he did, and I struggle with this as someone who's young and who's ambitious. And I'm having asked the question, is ambition bad? I want to write books one day to help the church. And now I'm listening to his episode about him promoting his books and going like, is this a bad ambition at all? And I wrestled with it for a while, but it reminded me of, has anybody read, you guys familiar with For Men Only? And then I think there's For Women Only. There's a book. Has anybody read For Young Men Only? Anybody else read that one? I read that when I was in high school, and it talks about the bad boy and why the bad boy always gets the girl. And I broke it down, and essentially the chapter was saying that you can not be the bad boy, but there's certain things the bad boy does. Here's why he gets a girl. It's not because he's bad. It's not that girls actually want a bad boyfriend. It's that there's certain things he does. For one, that the bad boy's usually very adventurous, right? And so he does things spontaneous. And so the chapter was saying you can be adventurous, you can be without being a rule breaker, without doing things that are wrong. And that I came back to that as I listened to this podcast, thinking, we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's what I fear. A lot of people are going to listen to this and throw any kind of, we have to do this now. Any method he did is wrong, or any sort of ambition or self-promotion, which that is still a larger conversation. But in ministry, what I'm saying is, I think I've landed that, okay, it's still okay to be big and bold, but don't make it about you, as Akeem was saying, as Steve was saying. It's okay to be countercultural. It's okay to be different, but there's a right and a wrong way to do that.
I absolutely love that you're addressing the pendulum swing that's possible, that can take place in all of our minds and our hearts. Oh man, I got to avoid everything that person was. And then I'm all the way over here and doing exactly the opposite. but in the wrong spirit. That is such a great concept. I think it's possible, from my perspective, as I listen to the podcast, to have an ecclesiastical structure that might tick all the boxes, yet still be absolutely in control and being a terrible person, a terrible human being. You can be a single elder-led individual, a pastor-led model, and be submissive to deacons, submissive to other pastors, submissive to people within the congregation. And you can absolutely lead in a plurality of elders and rule them in such a way where you know how to pull the strings to make everything happen the way you want it to happen. So I'm not sure that an ecclesiastical structure where you tick the boxes that fit within your framework of a network or a denomination is really the answer. I think it's a heart posture. And that heart posture of, I'm wanting to learn, I'm kind, I'm humble, I'm listening to others. I want to not be the guy. I want to be the guy, as that great Twitter guy says. I want to be the guy who points people to the guy. Isn't that a great statement? I want to be the guy. Aaron is raising his hands. Aaron, why don't you share your thoughts here?
Yeah, so sorry to speak twice on this. We were talking, if I'm, hearing what Akeem's saying about the idea of we don't need to do everything ourselves and certainly don't make it about us. One of the things that kind of stood out in the final 2 episodes of the podcast was the way that Driscoll got such traction and tried to build the church by defining Mars Hill against other churches. And I think that a lot of us who've had that independent Baptist background, we recognize that right off the bat. Build the siege mentality, tell people that, we're the faithful ones, the faithful few. And we've seen that. I've been privileged to be part of a church planter assessment here in Seattle for the last 4 to 5 years. And it's unfortunate that we typically get guys, I say typically, it happens every now and then, we get guys coming in to plant a church in Seattle, and what they want to do is they want to be the next Mark Driscoll. That is their thing. They want to come in, ride in on a white horse, save the city, and be the guy, like you just said. Those guys don't last. In the last 5 years, I've lost count of the number of church planters who have come and gone. And, I believe God is sovereign, but I don't think his kingdom is served that well when that happens. And that's a very broad statement. There's a lot of specific situations. The guys that stay are the guys who come in and recognize we are a team trying to reach this city for Christ. And I'm going to lean on my brother pastors, and I'm going to just reach out for the resources that I've got in the churches and associations around me so that I can stay here and reach the people God has called me to reach, and they're going to reach the people God's called them to reach, and together we reach this city. All right, we don't need another Mars Hill. And actually, in God's plan, there was a positive. Mars Hill fell apart, and what did we get? We got a bunch of independent autonomous churches that many of them today are still thriving and reaching the city. So I would just say that interdependence is not just within our churches, but amongst our churches.
This beautiful concept that's brought out. I blessed because I pastor in Las Vegas. And I say that because what I love about the spiritual leadership of Las Vegas is you've got Vance Pittman, who leads in the SBC. You've got Benny Perez, who leads in the AOG. You've got Judd Wilhite, who leads in the Christian denomination. And I'm telling you, these are 3 great leaders who constantly speak well of each other and even sit together so often. And I'm amazed by it. All fundamental in their doctrine, all very evangelistic in their evangelical position. But what I'm amazed by is the spirit of unity in this city. And I do think that that's important, not painting yourself as the hero of the city, but part of the team, the broader family of God or Church of God in the city. Justin.
So another thing that I saw in this that I found, I guess, interesting and how it affected me was a lot of what was stated, especially near the middle part of the podcast episodes, was the content of what he was preaching, both behind the scenes in the special groups as well as in the major groups. And I don't know about you, but I remember being around when Mark was at his heyday. And he was had a tremendous ability to make old historic doctrine very relevant to today. Something that I just found amazing. But what I discovered is the other end of that is sometimes you can get so trendy, because he was the only one doing this. I don't know if you remember the elephant in the room. I think it was called the elephant in the room episode that was being done. And a lot of those preachers wound up going through a lot of issues today. But we can become so relevant for a time, and it just doesn't age well. Think about how much our culture has changed to take what used to be very popular teaching. And now, because of Me Too movements and such like that, we've changed our entire identity of how we view some of those key things that back then was very trendy, but right now it just didn't age well. It expired very quickly. And so one of those things that I would think would be good for us is not to try and get too trendy on the old stuff, but give it clearly in its history, because you can get trendy, but I think there's another ditch on the other side when you take that to an extreme. And that's kind of one of the things that I picked up from a personal standpoint, is being careful in how you are how you are giving the message.
It's one of the reasons why I went back and sold all my skinny jeans. That and multiple other reasons. Very good, Justin. I think it was a great thought that you brought to the table. Anybody want to follow up on that thought before I bring to that third question to the conversation? Yeah, Steve.
I just want to just bring out, I don't really, it's more of a question, because I love the conversation, but my question would be is where does ambition fall? Because for me, I agree with Matt, what Matt was saying about being ambitious. I'm reading in the comments here about, well, pastors just want to build their brand. I don't know about you, but like, I promise you, like in my own heart, like I've never woken up in the morning. It's like, let me build my brand and build my kingdom. And I'm not doing all this for me. I honestly want to see people reach for Jesus. And so I think there's a fine line there, because I feel like we have to put ambition and vision and passion in its proper place. And where does that fall? Where does that balance at when it comes to reaching people for Christ, and at times having to put yourself out there and having to have vision and be a strong leader? Where does that balance? I'd love to hear. He won't talk unless I mention his name, but I'd love to hear like what Pastor Robbie Green has to say on that.
Robbie, I'd love to hear from you as well, and then we'll go to Nick.
Well, I think that I think you hit on something great, Steve. So much of this is a heart issue that starts with, what is our motivation? If our motivation is to reach as many people as possible for the kingdom of God. So I'm dealing with this right now in our church. We're launching a Spanish service this year, or in first quarter of 22, launching a Vietnamese service in 23. And so now I've got a church member, very small minority, but you're just ambitious trying to build your kingdom here at Levon Drive. That's what she came in and exploded on a staff member last week. Thankfully, I was out of town traveling, so I wasn't here. But I just dealt with this with my staff member this morning, and I said, I think the difference is, if you're trying to build your brand, and that's what your brand is, guys, our brand is not our brand. We are doing something for the kingdom. And if we're kingdom focused, that means that I rejoice when one of you have a win that I don't have. I rejoice when the pastor across town has double the first time guest on Easter that I had, rather than looking at him across town going, well, why does he get it and I don't? And what am I going to do? I mean, I literally know of a church here in our area that's an extreme IFB church that they spend their time in staff meeting talking about who's the biggest churches in town. And I pick out on the IFB, that could be said for any movement. But guys, if that's our motivation, God's not going to bless that. God blesses kingdom work. I'm here to build the kingdom of God. I'm here to do his work. And the reality is, the chances that I'm going to have the largest church in the Idea Network are very small. And that's okay. That's not what God called me to do. It's not why I'm here. And so I think it really starts with us getting alone with God and making sure that our walk with God is where it needs to be, that we can clearly look ourselves in the mirror. And I think Josh or someone else said it earlier today. What does our spouse say about us? I can stand up here and preach and fool 1,000 people on Sunday morning, no problem. But when I talk about my vibrant walk with God, does my wife agree that I have a vibrant walk with God? And does my wife, who knows me better than anybody, does she agree that my motive is to build the kingdom of God, or my motive is to, and I asked that staff member today, I said, I want you to speak truth. It's my executive pastor. I said, speak truth into my life. Do you see something in my life that says that I'm trying to build the kingdom of Robbie here? Because if it is, I need you to point it out to me, and I need to deal with this promptly, because the best of men are men at best. And guys, pride is a deceitful thing that creeps into our life and ultimately destroys us.
I love what you said, Robbie. Another word for ambition is zeal. And the two times that stand out in church history or Christian history when it comes to zeal, Jehu in 2 Kings chapter 10 says, come with me, I'm very zealous for God. And what you'll see him do is great things for God. He does incredible things for God. But suddenly that zeal was no longer about God, and it became about himself. And the acts that Jehu does end up shadowing everything that he had accomplished before. Same thing happens with the Maccabees. If you study the story of the Maccabees, Judas Maccabees was zealous for God, and all the things he did were amazing, but his zeal for God, I think, turned into a zeal for self. And then suddenly what you see is the Pharisees coming from the Maccabeans. So I think there's a real power when God puts an ambition inside of some of us and a zeal to do something great for God. But I think where there is a strength, there's always a shadow. And if we're not careful of the shadow that comes along with that ambition, we're going to end up having a legacy of a Jehu or the legacy of the Maccabees. And that's really dangerous. Nick, what are your thoughts?
So on the question, as far as when it comes to the ambition, I think kind of that, kind of line that's drawn in the sand that we need to really look for is the fact that, when people are getting hurt. So there were people who were getting wounded and hurt. And I'm not talking about just not getting their way. I mean, there was plenty of evidence of people being wounded by Mark or by the decisions he was making or how he was making those decisions. I think that's one of the first telltale signs of, okay, we're kind of crossing the line as far as our ambition, because we're now crossing into what we shouldn't be doing. I think it was Carey Newhoff or someone here recently was talking about how people would leave the church and just considered that as kind of a natural thing, but then really had to change his own heart in that mentality, because yes, people are going to move on, but it's our attitude kind of when they do. And so I think that would be one kind of telltale sign. When it comes to the structure, I've seen it work in multiple ways when it comes to a plurality of elders, or when it comes to essentially a single pastor that may have a group of deacons. I think what we need to kind of note is that Mark did what he did with 60 plus elders. So, if you listen on the podcast, they talk about how many elders were on that team. So I think it goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier this year with some of the things that the network has gone through with where's that accountability, who's able to speak into our life. I think whether you're a pastor leading a church by yourself, kind of in that sole leadership position, or you've got a group of elders serving with you, who's able to have those tough conversations, or to say, hey, that attitude was wrong, or the way you spoke to that person was wrong. And do we allow that? Because, I think the danger of the podcast can be that any strong personality, you're going to have staff and you're going to have people who go, oh, he's the next Mark Driscoll, because leaders have to make tough decisions in the face of opposition. So there's always going to be pushback, and there's always going to be people who, oh, you're a controlling leader or whatever that situation is. But I think the Bible gives us the solution to that. Receive not an accusation against an elder unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses. I think in this case with Mark, there were multiple witnesses saying, hey, there's a problem here. But they refused to listen. And I don't know if that's because their job counted on it. And I think that's why some of that accountability for pastors needs to be outside of the staff, and needs to really be maybe other pastors or someone who has no vested interest or is not threatened by their job being lost if they speak up and say, hey, this was wrong, this was a wrong attitude. When I planted the church and didn't have like a group of elders or anything like that, I had pastors who served as an oversight to us, who could ask me the tough questions, helped us with financial decisions, things like that. So there was accountability even when we didn't have it in-house. So I think it can be done, but it goes back to us. Are we willing to have people hold us accountable, no matter what your structure is? Who can speak into our life? Because it could be this situation with Mark Driscoll, or it could be what we dealt with as a network earlier this year with sexual immorality, or you name it.
I love it. I'm really glad you spoke up on that, Nick. What you said was brilliant. Harley, I'll go to you. You're muted, Harley. You're still muted, Harley.
I'll get it here. Just to piggyback on what was just said, I think one of the major issues was staff were also elders. So, we're firing elders. And I think that's something we have to be careful of, in whatever polity we have, that we don't have that conflict of interest. I work for you, but I'm also holding you accountable. That just doesn't work.
Some good thoughts there. For those of you who are getting concerned about time, some of you are like me and you're control freaks, and you're like, there's 7 minutes and we're not getting to Josh Cox and he's freaking out over here. Josh knows full well that his conversation is bridging into next week. We talked about it yesterday, actually, because what we're doing, surprise, surprise, is moving this into 2 weeks, and everybody is welcome back. Even if you're not a member, we want you to come back for the conversation. And next week, we're really going to take the entirety of the time to really discuss that 4th question that Josh is going to bring to us. And that is, what is the role of CT Magazine and periodicals? And is there any danger in just saying, man, I absolutely 100% just swallow everything that's stated, 2.5 hours per episode. So Josh, talk a little about that. I'm really interested in that conversation. Where does Christian journalism play in the evangelical church in America? But for the last 5 minutes, we'll address that 3rd question. That is, what about the megachurch? The megachurch is not a uniquely American concept. Oh, dear Lord, head on over to Korea and look at the churches that are being established in Korea and all throughout the Far East, or even throughout history, large churches, we understand, even just 150 years ago with Spurgeon. So, but the question is there a place and a time where a church can grow beyond the ability of the shepherds of that specific local church to care for the flock? The reason I bring it up is because of the podcast itself, not because of Mars Hill, but because in the podcast, it seemed like that was being brought out quite a bit. And it is something that I've thought about. I've addressed in my own life and really thought through how large do we want the church to grow, and to what extent, and when does church planting come in? And what about this multi-site thing? Does it actually function well? Will it ever function well? Should it function well? These are great questions to ask. I'd be really interested to hear, again, no judgment. I'd be loving to hear your unvarnished thoughts as you bring it before the group. Anyone you want to tackle that one and say, you know what, Josh, when it comes to mega church, when it comes to the ability to shepherd a certain amount of people, where is that number? What does that look like? It seems like Dale's ready to speak into that. Dale? No? Oh, Dale was scratching his chin. All right. Well, it gets itchy, that beard. Robbie, go ahead.
So I think, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer. This really comes from pastoring in the city of megachurches. So Dallas has probably more megachurches per capita. If we're not the top, we would be very close to the top of the list. I will tell you, I follow what other churches and denominations, all that. I watch all that very closely because I want to learn from what's good and I want to learn from maybe what's not as good. Almost without exception, there are very few mega churches in the Dallas area that are growing, and most have been in decline for a large number of years and are masking it by multiple campuses. They're masking it by just, quite honestly, I'm friends with some of their staff, and that their numbers just are padded to they're adding online viewers and everything else now to keep the mystique, you know, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain type thing. I think it goes back to the size of the church is influenced by what is your motivation. Is your motivation, I know I could name, and I won't, but I could name you 2 or 3 churches that I'm close enough to leadership that's in their church, maybe not the senior pastor. To be clear, I'm not friends with any of the megachurch senior pastors here. They wouldn't know who I am at all, but I am friends with some of their staff. I think when there comes a point that you are no longer, as a senior pastor, as a leader, when you are no longer, when your number one goal is no longer how can I build the kingdom of God, no longer how can I help my people grow to their next step spiritually, but how do we keep the attendance up? How do we keep the image in our community that we're still number one, or we're at the top, or whatever? I think, guys, this is when the mega church, I don't think there's anything wrong with a large church. I have seen some outstanding mega churches that have flourished and done well. I think when we get to the place that our goal is to be a mega church, our goal is to be the biggest dog on the block. Our goal is to take, I know of a pastor in Michigan that is taking out churches right and left right now because his attitude is to be the biggest thing in the city. That's when the megachurch model is broken. And it's not because it's a megachurch model, it's because it's a broken leadership model.
Great statements, Robbie. I appreciate that. We'll tear it down brick by brick. Josh Cox, go ahead, share.
Yeah, I think interesting case study in this would be Matt Chandler's church, who was multi-site and massive, and who about 3 years ago decided to make all of their campuses churches. And they've been going through that process over the last 2 to 3 years. And I don't know how COVID has affected it, to be honest with you. But basically all of those village church campuses are now independent churches pastored by those campus pastors. So I think that's an interesting study, a church that started out wanting that multi-site, massive, who got into it and then said, oh, wait a minute, maybe we need to step this back. And so they've actually gone the opposite direction. I think that the natural culture in our, no matter if you're in California or you're in Georgia, I think the natural is becoming more and more one of two things. They either want small and intimate, or they do want something where they can come in anonymity. And so I do think the megachurch will still be around. But the question is that a biblical, or is that the most biblical model? Is there accountability built in there? Is there the ability to be shepherded and to shepherd inside of the megachurch? And so for us, when we planted, we didn't put a number on it, but I just prayed that God would show me when we had reached our potential, when we have reached our max to be able to personally minister to people. And whenever that is, that number for me is going to be different than it's going to be for every single one of these guys here. But whenever we reach that, I prayed that God will show that to me, and we'll begin the process of then planting autonomous churches out from our church. And so that's the goal for us, is God, how can we minister? And I guess for me, if I ever go out to eat somewhere and have someone come up to me and go, hey, pastor, and I go, hey, like, who are you? And they go, oh, I go to your church. If that ever happens to me, I think I'm too big. If it's ever to the point where I've got people attending my church and I don't have a clue who they are, there's no way I'm shepherding them. And maybe, of course, there's leadership structures and pastors underneath me, and all that can happen for sure. But that's just for me. For me, I feel like that would be where I would get to the place where I'd be saying, listen, I'm big enough now. We're going to need to start planning churches for sure.
Absolutely love some of the thoughts. Thanks, Josh, for sharing. And that does really lead us into next week. We try to keep it tight, right around 60 minutes, guys. And so we're going to let you go. Next week, we really do want to continue this conversation. We won't for weeks. It'll just be next week. And next week, we really want to focus on the concept of Christian journalism in the modern evangelical movement. CT Magazine, we've talked a lot about Mark. We should. We talked a lot about Mars Hill. We should. Now let's focus our attention on evangelicalism as a whole and CT Magazine. Let's talk about Cosper. Let's see where he's coming from. Maybe he's the purest thing that ever walked the earth. Maybe not so much. So the question is, should we be wise in what we're receiving, asking questions about how we should grow from mistakes, and also be wise on what we're filtering as it comes in? I think it'll be a fascinating conversation and one I'm excited about having next week with you guys right there at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Thanks, guys. Check it out later. If you're watching this later, we hope to see you live next week if you can. Bye now.